All right, all you positive heads. On this week's Soul Share episode, I'm very excited to have Dr. Raymond Moody and Paul Perry here with me on the show. Raymond is recognized as the father of the modern NDE or near death experience movement, thanks to his pioneering work with the book Life After Life, which revolutionized the way we think about death and what lies beyond. Paul has assisted in moving that movement, having co-written several New York Times best-selling books on the afterlife as well. Very excited to explore this timely conversation with you both. Hello, Raymond. Hello, Paul. Welcome to the show, my friends.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Brandon, and thanks to the folks listening in too.
Yeah.
Yeah, my brother is going to be excited about this one. He sort of is obsessively, researching near-death experience
Is he really?
stories, and yeah, it's something for many,
Yes.
many 10 plus years he's been very interested in, and for
Yeah.
whatever reason, that and UFOs, those are his two. He's like always, interested in,
There
and
seems to
so
be a connection.
ah,
Don't,
well, yeah.
there does seem to be a connection between UFOs and near-death experiences because they do come up a lot in the same conversation, right?
You know, it's very interesting that here in 2023, we see the question of life after death and the question of extraterrestrial life as distinct questions. But
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to go far back in time to see where they merge into one question. For example, in the early 19th century, there was a man named Chalmers in England who was both a it's like a person in the church, some kind of whatever, and also had studied astronomy and knew about it. And he and what had happened was that with the when they realized Immanuel Kant realized that this thing we're in is a big flat galaxy. Okay, I mean
Mm-hmm.
he
Mm-hmm.
put all that together about the galaxies and planetary formation. And
Mm-hmm.
when people realized the vastness, they it kind of everybody woke up at once. It's like, uh-oh. It's like if life is here, about what about like there?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then the question was the Bible. Uh-oh, we got to fit the Bible into
Of
this.
course, you got to
So Chalmers
retroactively.
came and created this sensation on both
Yeah.
sides of the Atlantic about saying that the what are all these other planets out there for?
Yeah.
Right? Because how do you fit that into the Bible? And the answer Chalmers gave was that those are the abodes of our deceased human,
Interesting. Interesting.
and which is an idea that the Greeks had. It was more literal with them. It's the popular belief the stars were the souls of the dead in that
Right.
vein. But
Right.
now going back even further in 1600, um, Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake for teaching not that the sun was the center, which almost got Galileo burned,
Right.
but rather for teaching that there is no center because
Right.
every one of those stars out there has planets around them.
Right.
And so Bruno's in a Pythagorean tradition that goes back to Pythagoras. Bruno alleged that there is interstellar reincarnation. Get that?
Mm.
That when
Wow.
that reincarnation occurs not just here on this world, but that you can reincarnate on the stars of the universe. And
Yeah.
this was 1600,
Wow.
right? And so this connection between these two puzzles has been around for a long time.
Well, this is a couple of interesting things. One thing was that Chalmers saw the canals on Mars, right?
Right.
That was Chalmers. That wasn't until the 20th century was the canals on Mars. Chalmers was earlier. He was like 1810, 1820 was when he created this sensation. But that the The canals were kind of, that was an Italian astronomer who conjectured that, and that I think that was 19th century later, and then in the 20th century, so it's a long
But
story.
there were
Yeah,
people who believed that the canals represented a city on Mars.
that's
With
right.
cities.
That was a long time back until the 20s, I think. That
Yeah,
in 30s people started. But when the telescopes got a better resolution, see,
yeah.
Yeah.
they
Right.
realized that it was an optical illusion. Those canals.
Mm.
But
So
we have seen. I mean, I've seen older than y'all. I'm 79. In my lifetime, I have seen a whole world
Yeah.
built up on the imagination of people about Mars. See,
Yeah.
when I was a kid, the idea was, well, maybe there are these canals, and it seemed like there were seasonal changes. There must be some kind of primitive um,
Life.
plants there that change. But then, then with the flybys, all of a sudden we realized it's a cratered world. And I mean, it's just fantastic to see how, as observed in my lifetime, from the imaginative picture of the world of Mars when I was a kid,
Yeah.
I've seen that totally changed
Hmm.
into the construction of another world almost.
so
Interesting.
back to aliens for a minute, and death, and I guess near death experiences as well. One time, couple of years, well, it was probably 4 or 5 years ago. I was with Raymond. I think we were in when you lived in Alabama, and a guy came to see you from Iowa. He was from with the big yoga group in Iowa, and he came out. And his question for Raymond was, this was the reason for his voyage. His question to Raymond was, people people who almost die will see beings sometimes who fit the description of aliens.
Hmm.
Therefore, if aliens die and we die, do we all go to the same heaven?
Mm.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Remember
really
that?
yes, and that is, that's a long puzzle to me. I mean,
Yeah.
it's and that was the Swedenborg from the,
Right.
I think, 17th century was onto this too. He had visionary voyages, and he too was one of the people who said, kind of like Kant, that this universe we are in is peopled by all these rational beings all over.
Right. Right. It would make sense that, and
Mhm.
I have friends who claim and feel that they can remember other lifetimes and even lifetimes on other planets. And I've talked to people who've had the experience. I think of a friend who, using plant medicine, using ayahuasca, having an experience of being this extraterrestrial entity giving birth, and
Well,
uh,
that will definitely take you to another planet.
indeed. I have one UFO experience in myself that happened a couple of years
Yeah.
ago. I shared when it happened on the show, where it was like, I was at a transformational festival, and me and my partner see these lights over the lake, and it's like, that's not moving like a normal plane or even a drone. It's too far out, and it was a red light on it. And I said out loud, I said, if you're not a drone, flash green at us. And it instantly, a big bright green flash.
Huh.
And then I meditated to try and kind of connect with it in that moment. It was a very sort of intense experience, and that's what I came away feeling from it. Was it felt like a future version of self, or in some way,
Interesting.
you
Well,
know
we had this experience here about, I guess it was about 20 years ago now, if not a little bit less, called the Phoenix Lights.
yeah, I remember that.
And let's remember that where the lights police departments followed the lights down from Nevada
Hmm.
past the Grand Canyon. They chased them all the way to Phoenix, and then they appeared over Phoenix in a triangular shape,
Yeah.
and they were remarkable. But people now are reporting that they were transformed by this.
Hmm.
And I'm involved in a transformation study regarding the Phoenix Lights.
Interesting. Even the governor of Arizona
The
took a turn.
Governor Symington saw it. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
right. I remember that. I remember
Yeah.
that.
Well, a lot of people saw it. People were out on golf courses and saw it. So
Well, we dove right in the deep end of the pool. We
we did.
swam past near death into extraterrestrial life. If we could back up just a little bit, and what I'd like to hear is a little bit for those who aren't familiar with your work. Just whatever backstory is relevant to share about how you guys ended up on this fascinating exploratory path that you're on.
Okay, can I start on this, Raymond?
Yeah, sure.
Because this is why we came today, is
Yeah,
to
right.
talk about our new book, Proof of Life After Life: 7 Reasons to Believe in the Afterlife. And it's, near-death experiences are absolutely amazing. I mean, people who almost die they leave their bodies. They'll see the surgeon if it's in a operation room theater. They'll see the surgeon working on them. Sometimes they'll leave the surgery. They'll move into another part of the hospital and be able to recall what it was they saw. They go up a tunnel. They see dead relatives, and somewhere along the line, they encounter a being of light, and this being of light is very transformative to them. The problem, if there indeed is a problem with a near-death experience, and when it comes to research, is that it's a subjective experience.
Right.
So, in other words, the person who has it is really the only one who can describe what they saw, and that makes it subjective.
Yeah.
But throughout all the years that we've worked on near-death experience books and other things, we've been able to record shared death experiences.
Mm.
And a shared death experience is when a dying person shares their experience with at least one other person who is living.
Mm.
So,
So
and
they're
what we
both
found,
experiencing the same thing,
yes,
essentially. Wow.
oftentimes that's the case.
Wow.
And Raymond has his own story about that with his mother. But what we deduced is that is a objective experience, and that is objective proof
Mm.
that consciousness can survive without the body.
Right.
And so that's what we started to look into with this book,
Wow.
and we've divided it into 7 chapters. Each chapter deals with the different aspect of the shared death experience and different types of shared death experiences as well. So that's what this book is about: is
Amazing.
objective proof of consciousness surviving the bodily death.
How does a shared death experience? Is it? I mean, I haven't heard a lot about SDEs,
Right.
and so I'd imagine many listeners have not as well. Is it an experience where sometimes both are sort of let's say had a car crash together and are both there through some
There
sort
are
of a
those.
trauma, or also maybe one is having the near death experience, the other is in a dream state, and I guess
There,
I'm curious
there
about
are
the.
just infinite variations. As a
Yeah,
matter
right.
of
That's what
fact,
I'd imagine.
years ago, I talked, this was, gosh, in the early 70s, I talked with a couple a priest and a nun who had gone off a hill together
Wow.
and severely injured, and both had simultaneously near death experiences in which they were communicating.
Wow.
But, it's funny. It's there. These shared death experiences have always been around. When
Hmm.
I was in medical school, my first year in medical school, one of my own professors told me about an experience that she had in which she had been unsuccessfully trying to resuscitate her mother. And that as she was trying this, when she felt her mother die, that she herself, my professor, rose up. She saw the scene from above. She
Wow.
said, I think she said, as I was trying to get my bearings, she said, she became aware of her mother there with her, now in spirit form. She said,
Wow.
she said her goodbyes to her mother. She saw this tunnel or passageway and saw emerging from it. Her deceased relatives, some of whom she recognized, of
Wow.
her mother, and so on. And over the years, I've repeatedly talked about these things, and Paul and I have written about this for a long time. We wrote a book on it, Glimpses of Eternity, years and years ago. But
Wow.
I think it's so fascinating, Brandon, that just like you said, people haven't woken up to this.
Yeah.
They woke up to near death experiences. Oh my goodness, dramatically worldwide in 1975 and 6. Uh, but there is there's plenty of information on this now.
Huh.
Interesting question is, why hasn't it taken off?
Oh, I can tell you why.
And I think the reason is that we are so accustomed, beginning with Plato and Democritus, the Greek philosophers,
Mm-hmm.
who had this debate 2,400 years ago.
Right.
Democritus says there's no such thing as a moment of death. He said that even when the body appears dead, there's still biological activity. He was an atomist, realizes
Yeah.
minute things going on in the body that are
Sure.
not detectable. And that's how he explained this. Um, Meanwhile, Plato looked at this and said, indicator of an afterlife.
Yeah.
So this, and we just, Lavoisier, discovered oxygen. So today, instead of, we say oxygen deprivation to the brain, right? But it's the same argument. Some look at this as indicators of an afterlife. Others indicate as, brain damage or oxygen deprivation. And so the debate hasn't gone anywhere in 2,300 years, right?
Yeah.
It's the same form of debate. And I think that many people are, even if on the conscious level they are somehow accepting of this, this is very unsettling information. My goodness, for many people. So I think that one reason why the shared death experience hasn't uh, sort of flowered yet is because people are scared.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like if you laid out of that framework of the oxygen deprivation to the brain versus the afterlife. Well, if that framework is exploded because, it's the people who standing by don't have oxygen deprivation, but they have the same experience. Now, what do we say?
Yeah.
It doesn't follow from the fact that these experiences are not oxygen deprivation to the brain, that therefore they are, life after death.
Right.
So we are left suspended, and many people are terrified of having to say, I don't know, or thinking that something that's important is unsettled. So where I see this is going in the 50, 60 years I've studied this, I think that in the 70s, when my book came out, see, the reason it was so quickly accepted was that by that time, the cardiopulmonary resuscitation technique was so widely employed that something that had always existed but was just extraordinarily rare suddenly, just within a few years, becomes very common. And now, 50 years on from that, it's even more so. It's that so many people out there have, in effect, been on a temporary voyage to the other side.
Yeah. Yeah.
That it's like that, in a funny sort of way, the afterlife is penetrating this life. And I think that the reason why people haven't woken up to this implications of the shared death experience is that they can't even begin to put it together to comprehend. I mean,
Right.
what is this?
Right.
At
But I
least having the physiology versus afterlife debate gives you some kind of security. You can think about it, but now, bang, that's gone. So, what is this?
so I also think that I'm going to toot Raymond's horn a little bit, but the work of Raymond in the 70s, when he named and defined the near-death experience, gave people a context
Yeah.
into which to tell their story.
Right.
It used to be wacky, and now because there's this context that names and describes it, people said, "Well, I've had that, and
Yep.
this is a medical definition, so I feel free to talk about it."
Yep.
And it's the same now with shared death experiences and with other things like we talk about here on terminal lucidity, where people are now that it's named and defined, people have uh, a box to put it in, and they're free to talk about it. I mean, years ago, Raymond and I wrote our first book, The Light Beyond, was in 1988 or something like that. And I was working on that book, and I went out one night with some friends, and went to a movie, and then we ended up at Denny's, which a lot of people end up late at night. And we were there was like 5 or 6 of us sitting at the table, and we're talking about what we're up to. And they said, "Well, what are you working on?" I told them about near death experiences. Well, they just thought it was bull. I mean,
Yeah.
for the most part, not everybody, but most of the people at the table thought, "Well, this is nonsense. It's a fantasy."
Sure.
So I I did what I called the Denny's experiment, where there were about 20 other people in the restaurant, and I stood up and told people, introduced myself, told them what I was working on, named it, described it. Has anyone had this experience, or has this experience taken place in your family? About 12 to 15 of these 20 or so people had
Wow.
either had an experience or they had family members who had
Right.
experiences like this, and they talked about them. And that's
Wow.
the case with this because there's a context in which they fit. People are now wide open
Yeah.
to talking about them,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's really the benefit of Raymond's work and our work on this book,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
that we give people time.
That's amazing. Yeah. If you start bringing it together, someone either has had an experience or knows someone who's had an experience, and we were talking a little bit about before we started recording some of the experiences that people will have, shared death experience, like the woman you said who was actually connecting and sort of seeing the same thing her mother who's transitioning was seeing.
Right.
I had someone on the show a while back who shared their experience, which as their parent passed in the room, like a light appeared and it was like an angelic entity or something. And so that's something that you see a lot of as well, right? Like either light or mist or music or different sort of almost paranormal activity happening at the time
Right.
of death.
Yeah. And, some of the things, it's just like this thing is Winston-Salem, North Carolina,
Mm,
back in the early 2000s.
mm-hmm.
My wife and I went up there, and I did some uh, lectures up there, but for my sister, actually, Carol.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so one of the places I went to visit while I was there was this hospice. And I just went in there to talk to the people who worked there.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to emphasize anybody who has been in the medical community knows that there's a certain kind of nurse that is very earthy.
Mm.
That, I mean, it's a hard thing to describe, but they have had such a life experience that is so good with the patients. It's just like a certain kind of groundedness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was this guy, and there weren't many people. It's just like a couple of people came, and I went to visit to talk to these couple of people, the nurse and this guy who was kind of like the chaplain. And they were telling me that is kind of like what you were saying, Brandon, that this family had been um, uh, their relative, whatever, mother, whoever it was, had been in the dying process for a long time, and the family was there. And so the nurse and the chaplain told me that one day they just heard this coming from the room, and they both saw light burst forth from the room,
Wow.
which you always
Wow.
rationalize. And that they said, well, maybe it was something going by on the street outside that reflected the light in. But no, the people in the room were saying this this light, and they
Wow.
saw this. And so anyway, the one of the family members in the room was so impressed by this light that he took a photograph.
Wow.
And they showed me this photograph. It was sitting right there. I was sitting on this little sofa, and right beside me was this little end table or thing. And the photograph on there, and it was just extraordinary. It looked, I mean, it just the most beautiful thing. It was like an entranceway into some other world.
Was it a
Wow.
And,
sustained light?
hmm,
Was it sustained? Like, was it on for quite a while?
I don't remember. I remember they just said they were all impressed by the flash, like it just came off all of a sudden. But then the man, the family member, was so just astonished. He just took a photograph and showed this. It looks like an
It
entranceway,
must have been
but
sustained to some degree, right, Paul? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. But the trouble with this kind of information is that who outside of that little circle of people is going to believe this?
yeah, right.
Right? I mean, there's things happen that it, if we kept dwelling on these things, which so many people have experienced and were and meant so much to people,
Yeah.
if you dwell on it in a certain way, the whole illusion of this place collapses.
It really is.
And that becomes more evident the older you get, Brandon. I
Yeah.
was I'm 79 now. Okay, but when I was 30 years old, my book had already been published, and I was a resident, okay, and in psychiatry, and but I had also gotten a PhD in philosophy, and I'd been a philosophy professor for 3 years, so I was older than the other residents,
Yeah.
okay, in this little town. Plus, I was known for my book.
Yeah.
So, in any kind of little town, there has got to be some provision made that when the mayor or the chief of police or the local celebrities known all over the world who happen to live there, have a little mental problem, they can't go. I mean, it's just common politeness. You don't make to the chief of police show up at the mental health center, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
provisions are made just out of kindness.
Yeah.
So I was it for a year, and I had the most astonishing experience of dealing with very eminent people
Yeah.
and very accomplished people who mostly I quickly realized why they're there is the most common reason was, as I quickly figured, loneliness, right? They just wanted somebody to talk to, and
Mm-hmm.
situational stress, okay? And repeatedly during that year, I heard the same comment from these very reflective and accomplished older people. It's like in some version of the following words. Raymond, the older I get, the more this uncanny impression develops when I look back on my life that it's been a story or script or play or drama or movie or
Yep.
just different words but the same concept.
Yeah.
That this is a fictional framework, and
Yeah.
that we live these stories, and that and then at the end, it's kind of like at the end of this movie, it's kind of like time stands still.
Yeah.
And then you are surrounded by a panorama, total review of every detail of this
Yep.
story you just lived,
Yep.
except that you see it not just from the perspective you had when you did each action, but also from the perspective of those with whom you interacted.
Right.
And you see this commonly in the presence of a being of complete compassion
Yeah.
who sort of helps you look at this and who knows the story.
That's probably the most common NDE experience from what I've seen is I started having this, life review. Then I had the option to come back and
That's
like I'm sure you're familiar with Journey of Souls by Michael Newton and Destiny of Souls
oh
and,
yeah.
life
Mhm.
after life, sort of in between lives, I guess. And there's so much of that sort of idea that he sort of documents and with people who are under hypnosis, like, what happened to them in between lives. And that on that side, we really do look at it like, oh, I'm going
Yeah.
back onto the stage. I'm going back into the play. Like, let me put on my costume and, so.
The arch skeptic, Brandon, David Hume, who, Einstein said, talked about the way Hume influenced him.
Yeah.
David Hume, 1711 to 1776, friend of Ben Franklin's,
Mm-hmm.
and just like the most severe of skeptics,
Right.
who said, he said, as to the impressions which arise from the senses, he says, in my opinion, it is utterly beyond the power of reason to decide
Yeah.
whether they arise from the objects or the creative power of our mind
Mm-hmm.
or from the author of our being. That, in other words, that, we assume there's this external world, but that's entirely gratuitous.
Right. Right. There
And
is
that
no
even
out there.
with that, he said famously, he said, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. Some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that may enable us to comprehend that logic, which is what he was saying was it's impossible,
Yeah.
right? But even Hume, in writing this, said, he said, he thought, I think the only kind of afterlife that a rational person could entertain would be reincarnation. And he doesn't say why, but I suspect it's because Hume was most famous as a historian, and he understood the role of narrative and story in human
Yeah.
affairs, right? And so he would have gotten that of all the different models of the afterlife, the most story-like is reincarnation. It's
Mm-hmm.
like you tell a story, right? Then you're finished with one story, you go through some incomprehensible process, then you're back on another storyline.
Right.
Because heaven, I mean, I would think that would be pretty dull after a little while.
You can only play
There's
the
the
harp
light.
so long.
Does the light seem a little brighter today to you? No, it's still yesterday.
Still bright.
And
It's another perfect
library
day.
Report, it's a
for
light report.
6 bazillion years already. I read all those books.
Yeah.
You
Can only eat so many grapes.
that's right.
Right. Oh,
Oh man.
But
Yeah.
if the
Sorry, go ahead.
afterlife is couldn't it's more stories. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to know is there an overstory?
Mm-hmm.
In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, there's the overstory. The frame narrative is the trip the pilgrims are going to Canterbury, right? But then that frame narrative is a structure for telling the individual stories, like the Miller's
Mm-hmm.
Tale or whatever.
so
And
Mm-hmm.
same with Boccaccio's Decameron, 20 people in a villa passing the time during the plague by telling stories. So that's the overstory. Or more concretely, Ray Bradbury's Tattooed Man, right? The illustrated man, right? Where the tattoos come alive. So
Yeah.
what I want to know is, is the is there an overstory? Is the next level up? Is that a narrative experience too?
I believe
Or
I
is
would
there
I
some
would
other
imagine so
kind
if I
of
had to bet.
frame? Yeah, I don't know, but it's interesting to think.
Yeah. What do you
well,
think, Paul?
well, I don't know. We've never really talked about the overstory.
The story
So
nested within the story, nested within
there's
the
always
story.
yeah, there's always an overstory in
Yeah,
almost anything you're dealing with. Even when you
right,
order something off a menu, there's an overstory.
right,
So
right.
yeah, God bless it.
Right. Yeah. What I love is, of course, speaking of story, there's so many fascinating stories of NDEs and, mystical sort of spirit centric experiences where the veil thins. And, I've had a few, as I touched on myself, even,
Yeah.
a few months back where my grandfather and grandmother came to me in the dream state and told me, I want you to introduce you to this person. And I then look them up when I wake up to see if it's a real person, and it is, and it's relevant. And they said he was from World War II, and this person's from World War II, and a famous actor. And my son
Yeah.
later that day gets an audition for a World War II role, so I help him. He gets the role. Like it led to, and it's like it's for me personal, subjective.
Yes.
Firsthand, like this name and intro came from beyond the veil that led to a tangible experience.
Yes.
You'll see my son in World War II garb on my Facebook page, and that would not have happened had I not been introduced to this person in the dream that led to me canceling my plans to make sure he did the audition in time. And and it's
In
fascinating.
1981, Brandon, I had two wonderful sons, and that was in the era when you didn't know what was coming, right, male or
Mm-hmm.
female. But
Mm-hmm.
I had always wanted a daughter, and loved my dear sons, and at the same time, I always wanted a daughter. And my wife had preeclampsia the last time, so it wasn't so advisable
Mm-hmm.
to try again. So this night, I don't sitting on my porch swing in the backyard in the spring of 81 or maybe 82. I had a daydream, and that's what it was. I mean, but it was from very deep,
Mm-hmm.
and I have no idea where it came from. But the thought was, wouldn't it be wonderful to adopt a Native American daughter?
Oh well.
And I really dwelled on it that night. I mean, it was really deep. I don't know where it came from,
Huh.
but I didn't send it up as a prayer. It was just and so now
Fantasy kind of thing.
19 years later, I had adopted a son 2 years before.
Wow.
And this was in the year 2000. But 4 years before that, I'd met this Blackfeet woman in New Mexico, and it was a long story. But I just, the Blackfeet, you know, public speaking is not the style.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a situation where I just sort of took this Native American woman who was sitting next to me up to the microphone in the center aisle at a conference where she could ask her question. So that was, and how are you? My name is. Now 4 years later, out of nowhere, Christine called me up. How are you doing? I remember her voice. How are you doing? And I said, oh, we're doing great. We adopted a baby. And she said, oh, I wish so much I had known you were looking, because I work on the reservation and the hospital, and I'm the first person to know when we have a situation where we need an adoptive parent.
Wow.
So by all means, 2 months later, she called me. Your daughter is on her way.
Wow.
So, it's just like you're saying, it all fall in. Then, when my daughter was 9 years old, we had our route out in the country. We liked to walk. She said, sitting on this old wooden bridge one day. She said, about a mile from where we live. I don't like this place. And it was plain to me she meant this world.
Yeah.
So I was, huh? And she said, yeah. She said, when you die, and we didn't take these kids to church, and,
Yep.
we don't talk about life after death at home. We talk about, what's that, the movies,
Right. Right.
and the kid, and, the kids, we lived in Alabama. We didn't ever take them to church because we were afraid of snakes. That part's a joke. But, so, Carol Ann, it's just like, and she said, when you go up, she said, you just go up when you die, you just go up and you be with God, she says, and he holds you up there, she said, till all the people you know while you're alive have died, and then he sends you back as another person.
Yeah.
And I said, well, what makes you think so? She said, I just know in my
Wow.
mind like
Wow.
this. And she said, and I was with God, and he pointed you out to me.
Wow.
And he said, you got to go down to be his daughter.
Wow. And this was,
And
she
I
was
said,
9.
9. And I
Uh-huh.
said, well, how did you feel about that? She said, oh, I didn't want to do it. She said, I wanted to stay with my Gotti. But she said, but he pushed me twice, just like that, down to be
Wow.
your daughter.
Wow.
And she said, and she talked, by the way, Paul, about going down through the clouds,
Wow.
was her
Wow.
description of it. And so I said, well, are you glad you came anyway? She said, yeah, yeah. And, perhaps because I didn't dwell on it, she occasionally brings it up even now.
Wow.
It's just a few years ago. She said, I always wondered why they pushed me out of that light.
Wow. What a trip.
So this is about a a very well-known Hollywood producer whose name I can't reveal,
Hmm.
but she had gone back east. This was a couple decades ago, easily. She had gone back east to see her boyfriend,
Mm-hmm.
and her boyfriend didn't know her family at all.
Mm-hmm.
And they were both laying in bed in the morning, and she became very edgy. And as a result of being edgy, she woke him up. And she said, there's just something going on. I'm sorry, I'm really kind of shaky. Suddenly, above both of them, her
Wow.
father appeared. And he was just looking down at them. Her boyfriend didn't know what the father looked like, had
Wow.
never met the father. She was there, and she says, "Do you see this?" He did, confirmed that he did. And she said, "It's my father, and I think he's trying to get a hold of me for some reason. I've got to call him right away." And at that point, she called home, and he had passed
Wow.
away in the night. Her mother hadn't
Wow.
contacted her yet. Her boyfriend had no idea who he was,
And they had a shared
and
experience of him.
that in a lot of ways, it was a shared experience of him. For one thing, he shared his death experience with her, and
Wow.
with him too, and he perceived it in the same way
Wow.
that she perceived it.
What a powerful. It's funny that you mentioned a Hollywood, well-known Hollywood figure, female. The night of my friend's passing and my car getting stolen, hours before, I was at dinner with my girlfriend and our mothers who are meeting for the first time, and in walks Diane Keaton, a very famous actress, and who my mother's a huge fan of, and sits down right next to us. And I'm thinking, my mother's a huge fan. How can I make an intro here? And luckily, she turned around at the end of her meal and started critiquing me eating off my girlfriend's plate. And we got to take a picture and meet her, and it was a really cool moment, especially for my mother. Yeah,
Well, that's neat. Yeah, I wish they'd
yeah,
photograph this
wow.
one, but
What a great, great
so
shared experience. Woo.
yeah, it is. It really is, and
Yeah,
there's a number like that. Um, yeah,
very cool.
it's the book is full of those. Absolutely full of them.
So I'm curious what you guys think about this idea of communicating. In my case, I just shared a story of communicating, beyond the veil, and not,
Yeah.
unexpectedly. Now, of course, as synchronicity would have it, and I guess you could say tragedy from one experience. I mean, from one perspective, here I am having a conversation with, pioneers in, understanding beyond the veil. And, within this time last week, I was texting with a friend, and they had a tragic car accident a few days ago. And, now here this young, very vibrant, 35 probably years old, guy that is on the other side, and it's, a week ago he's at my house and talking to me, and and it's just like, and very close with my partner and girlfriend. And so, it's such a present thing. And then you think of, wow, they're still there in some other form. How do you can we consciously bridge that gap, and I know there
Have
is
you
a.
have you tried? Have you tried to bridge a gap with him?
I have not. No, I mean, of course, this has all to happen in the last few days, even. But I know you guys talk about this idea of a psychomanteum, and
Right.
I'm curious if you could share a little bit about what that is and what that, yeah, just how you use that.
Yeah.
Well, Brandon, Paul and all of my friends know that I'm such a bore because everything to me goes back to Greek philosophy.
Mm.
And the origin of Greek philosophy, one of the big parts of it was these places called oracles of the dead.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons why they got rid of Socrates was they associated with him with these calling up the spirits of the dead at these oracles of the dead.
Wow.
And so to make a long story short, there were about five, the most prominent of these oracles of the dead all around the Greek world, and they worked by different techniques. To make a long story short, by studying the archaeological report of, and went visited one of these places and talked to the archaeologist, I figured out what they were doing, and set it up, and it works. I mean, it is surprisingly easy
Hmm.
if you are interested in this to
Mm-hmm.
call up the spirit of the dead loved one, and to have in a full state of waking awareness what appears to be an encounter with a dead relative.
Wow.
And not only this, but this was known, it was, for reasons you can imagine, it was banned around 400 AD.
Yeah.
But the, the fact that it was banned shows that up to that time it had been in the Christian faith,
Mm-hmm.
that it was understood that you could do this. And then they prohibited it in 400 something for some reason. But it keeps cropping up, and it's been discovered repeatedly that, for example, the way they do it in the Middle East still today is if you take a silver bowl, polish it with on the inside, fill it with olive oil, and in a dark room by candlelight, you gaze into that surface like you're gazing into infinity.
Hmm.
And after preparation, now the preparation it doesn't happen by snapping your fingers. You've got to, it's like you kind of, I do it with, when I did it as sort of like a grief therapy, right? I would,
Mm-hmm.
and by the way, my subjects were my graduate students of psychology, a medical doctor, a sociology professor, a clinical psycho. This was, these were people, we were doing this out of curiosity,
Yeah.
right? And these were older psychology students and so on, very earthy people. So basically, I just set up a little room. What you do, you put a mirror on the wall. There are full instructions for this, aren't there, Paul? And
Yeah, there are in the book. Yeah.
in proof of life after life, you can explain how to set this up. You just set up a little mirror room where you can have it dark in there and a light behind you, and the mirror is placed in a way that's above your line of sight. So when you look into the mirror, you don't see a reflection, just like gazing out into infinity. And after a preparation in which I would talk with the people, like, tell me about this person who died, and what were they like? What are your happiest memories? What were the sticking points in the relationship? Takes an hour or two just to spell all this out. Then you put the person into this room, or let them sit there and get comfortable in an easy chair, just gazing away into the mirror. And under those circumstances, and by the way, this is no superpower of mine. I'm not, I don't
Yeah.
even have a turban,
Right.
right? But, it's nothing magic about me. You don't need, it's good to have somebody else there with you to facilitated conversation.
Yeah.
And the reason for this is if we just decide we want to see grandma and we're going to call her up tonight, we might think about just the good things,
Yeah.
right? You got to balance this out. Like, what was the hang-ups of the relationship, the whole thing, to sort of talk this out.
Yeah. Right.
Then you go in there, and what happens? Well, I mean, I just assumed that I thought it would be probably about 1 out of 10 people who would see something, but they would say, since these were my graduate students, I assume they say, yeah, I saw this image. It looked like my grandma, but was it real? Was it a figment? I don't know. That would be one I would expect.
Yeah.
But lo and behold, yeah, some people do see the image in the mirror. And then others say that, yeah, the image appeared in the mirror and then came out of the mirror into the
Wow.
room with me.
Wow.
Full three-dimensional. Other people say, my consciousness went through the mirror, and on this other realm is where
Wow.
I met my deceased relatives. About 30% of them hear an audible voice. It's with a people say it's like a quality. I've heard this myself. It's hard to describe it. It's like as a energy to it.
Yeah.
But the 70% or so, the rest of them who don't hear an audible voice, nonetheless have a heart-to-heart or mind-to-mind communion.
Wow.
And sometimes, sometimes the connection doesn't take place right there at the mirror. Sometimes it takes place later. So he has several examples of people who have gone through the procedure, have gazed in the mirror at his psychomanteum, and nothing has happened. But they've returned to the hotel, and at night, the person they wanted to see comes into the room.
Yeah.
And he had one that was particularly interesting because we have photographs of it, of a woman who came from Argentina. She wanted to see her daughter who had passed away from cancer. And she flew to Alabama with her sister. And she got off the plane, immediately wanted to go through the procedure, which is not what she should have done. But Raymond, she insisted, so Raymond, talked her through a procedure, and nothing happened. So she went home. She went back to the hotel. It was about 3:30 in the afternoon, and she was talking to her sister, who was with her in the room, and they were talking about the daughter and how she wished the facilitation had worked. And suddenly, into the room came 3 orbs, about the size of beach balls.
Wow.
And luckily, the sister took photos of them.
Wow.
So we have photos of these orbs, 3 orbs coming into the room, and it's bright.
And they said that they saw the sister, or the deceased one, within the orb.
Wow.
And she was able to sit and talk to her daughter within the orb, right in front of her.
Wow.
And we have photographs of those. I'll send you the photos if you'd like.
Wow. I'd love to see them. And
that's very objective.
Yeah.
Right. Obviously, that's a very objective experience. But he did Joan Rivers. He's going to get modest here, so I'll start throwing.
Yeah, consensual reality is such a fiction.
Mm-hmm.
It's not true to the human experience, because one thing you will find, Brandon, as you grow older. How old are you now?
49 years young.
49. Okay, I'm 70 now. I'm 30 years on with you. You're going to find as you grow older that the people you know who are close to you, who are your own age, that it's just a natural phenomenon that a greater and greater percentage of them have had some experience of going over to another realm.
Yeah.
So that, in life.
Raymond, tell him about Joan Rivers.
Yes, tell me about Joan Rivers.
Joan Rivers is a good story.
Yeah, well, she was such a lovely person, I gotta say. I just, as Joan Rivers, my main memory of her is, if you looked at her on TV, she seemed like a very sharp-featured person, kind of flinty.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, she was just so soft. It was just a lovely, lovely, soulful, sweet heart of a person. So she came to my place, and we took her through this, and she talked to her husband, who who had died,
Mm.
by suicide, actually.
Wow.
But it's Joan Rivers is a lovely person, and she was one of many, many lovely people who've come to my place and and talked to that. It's about in my study, it was about half of them who, on the first attempt, would have this experience,
Wow.
and they've also others have replicated this. For example, Arthur Hastings in California, the what was it, the transpersonal
transpersonal
psychology
psychology. Yeah.
place. It recreated my study, and he got it to where 68% of the people
Wow.
who will have this on the first attempt, and you can make it 100% if you
Wow.
first go through the process of seeing if people can see mirror visions rather than having an agenda. But
Right.
if you just put, say, a mirror in and say that get the person like in a dark room, gaze in there, do you see anything? And it doesn't have to be a dead relative, it's pictures or whatever. And when you know that about the person in advance, then it's 100%.
Wow.
I mean, I think it's best to, from my personal experience, to go into it expecting nothing,
Yeah. Right.
and let your subconscious take over.
Yeah. Right.
And
Just doing the experience is the you just going through the process is
and
what you can expect, and anything else
and
is going to be a
something
icing.
something comes out of the deep,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
oftentimes they say, well, it's what I needed to see. I
Yeah.
came in to see my grandmother, but what I really needed to see was my father, and he
Yeah.
emerged.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Very
So
early on, my subjects made that observation. The first person was a 44-year-old, very experienced drug and alcohol rehab counselor
Mm-hmm.
who had lost her husband 2 years before.
Mm-hmm.
And she prepared, we did the whole preparation to see her husband, but the person who showed up instead was her father.
Ah. Wow.
And then on reflecting in it, she said, Raymond, she said, as I thought about it, she said, who I wanted to see was my husband. But she said, as I really thought about it, that the person I
Yeah.
needed to see was my father.
Wow.
And
Yeah. Very.
that's a common thing I've heard. Like
Yeah.
a psychologist friend of mine, came to prepared to see his father, but the word came that, well, his father is not available because of it's a complicated story, but an aunt came instead.
Wow.
hmm.
Interesting. Yeah. That's an interesting thing to consider. Like, well, you're calling, but they're tied up at the moment.
Well, it's he was having a meal of manna.
Yeah,
That's
right, right, right. He was in that playing that harp, and mid.
yeah.
Wow.
He
How about you, Paul? Have you had any sort of firsthand experiences or
I
yeah?
did. I actually had a shared death experience. This is one thing that led us to do these books, by the way,
Oh wow.
because for years we had sat around, and I have hundreds of hours of tapes with Raymond, and
Uh
they
huh.
all have the sound of a rocking chair in them because that's what he likes to do is
Yeah, yeah,
rock.
yeah. I see that. I see that.
It's called Asperger's syndrome.
Yeah.
And
I
so
get it. I
we talked about a number of things, we've researched, and we started talking a lot about shared death experiences. But then we both had one, and I'll leave him to tell his. But mine was a little different, but it was a shared death experience for sure. Uh, my mother was dying of Alzheimer's,
mm,
and death was imminent. And the day she died, the morning before she died, I got a phone call from Vernon Neppy, who was the head of neuropharmacology at University of Washington. Vernon and I had worked on a book project. Vernon likes to do a lot of research on deja vu. So
ah,
we had worked on a book project with deja vu, but I hadn't, that it didn't work out. We both got busy with other things, and I hadn't talked to Vernon for 5 years.
mm,
And I was milling around in the living room, and I got a phone call from Vernon, and he says, I was sitting, it was on a Sunday, I was sitting at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, and I heard a female voice say, "Call Paul Perry."
Wow.
And I ignored it. And he said, I kept reading, and about an hour, half an hour later, this voice came in again, and it said, "Call Paul Perry."
Wow.
So I'm calling you, and I don't know why.
Wow.
And so I said, well, he said, "What's going on in your life?" So I told him about my mother. Because he was the head, the head of neuropharmacology, he knew about all the drug treatments, new and old, for things like Alzheimer's and other treatments as well. And so he started telling me, well, write this down, have your doctor prescribe this or do this. We've pulled people back from really deep Alzheimer's by doing electroshock therapy was one of
Wow.
his recommendations.
Wow.
And meanwhile, the phone is beeping uh, and telling me that someone else is calling. So I said, "Vernon, I'm going to call you back. I have to answer this call." And it was the care facility telling me that my mother had just died.
Wow.
And that, of course, is a form of shared death experience.
Right.
Why she, manifested to Vernon Neppy, whom I hadn't spoken to in 5 years,
Wow.
I have no idea. But there was definitely a connection here.
It's sort of like this guy, Vernon, is capable of hearing her, perhaps.
Yeah,
He's in a state of receptivity enough. And then so she can reach him. And it's a way of then saying, hey, look, here's the work you do. Let me show you that you are
yeah,
correct firsthand, son.
yeah,
And
right.
is kind of how I interpret it or think of it
That's
as,
how
as
I
I hear.
interpret it. But
Yeah.
the other thing is, speaking of doctors, is this book has more doctor participation than any other book we've written,
Wow.
and I think that really shows that the door has opened
Yeah.
on these experiences, and rather than deny them as they used to,
Yeah.
the doctors we try to talk to used to, now they don't.
Yeah.
Now they come to us and tell us stories,
Yeah. Wow.
and in this case, it was my mother and Vernon telling me something.
Beautiful.
But
Beautiful.
yeah.
Wow. And Raymond, you've had a story,
Oh,
a shared death
yeah, I
story as well.
did. I have been driven my whole life by curiosity, to tell you the truth.
No, I don't believe it.
I had two
No.
doctoral degrees, a PhD in philosophy plus an MD plus 3 years of teaching philosophy
Right.
before I was 31. And you're old enough to realize there was something very wrong with somebody who would have two doctoral degrees by the age. The one is true, isn't it? And it
Uh,
was. It's like my whole life, my nose in a book.
yeah. Right.
And I had to get sick to get out of that with
Yeah.
thyroid disease. But I had been, studying these shared death experiences for a long time. And in 1993, I was getting ready to do a study with a whole bunch of, and to make it a long story short, just like 2 weeks later, the same day I was organizing this study, I found out that my mother had been taken to the hospital for a rash, but on Mother's Day.
Mm.
But at that time it wasn't serious. But anyway, the next day she went to the doctor, and it turned out to be non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and
Oh
she
wow.
died 2 weeks later. But all of
Wow.
a sudden, this experience that I had been studying for some years, I was suddenly living. I mean, it was just really
Wow.
it's extraordinary. But it's like, and again, there aren't any words. To me, it was like I experienced my wife, my brother-in-law, my sister experienced my father who had died 18 months before. But saw him there, we experienced him there.
Wow.
And I mean, again, words fail, but
Yeah.
it's like it's no longer, you are no longer in a three-dimensional geometry,
Yeah. Right.
right? It's
Right.
and the light, it's hard to describe. And I heard my mother not through my ears, but the thoughts.
Mm.
So anyway, this is, it's and interestingly enough, that kind of backed me away from that area of research for a while, because I had to process my own
Right.
happening.
Right.
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 But in that connection, I have experienced what is to me, I think, Brandon, the most unsettling thing I have learned in a way, although I'm accustomed to it more now. And that is that literally all of the different experiences that we know of as a near death experience are also reported by the bystanders, including the life review of the person who is passing away. And to me, that is very unsettling information
Yeah.
because I'm hoping to recuse myself from my own life review. And,
Right.
to me, it's a horrifying thought that there might be a spectator there.
Yeah. Huh.
But I've talked with a lot of people. This woman who is married to her husband, I mean, just literally grew up as a neighbor to her husband, and they had this incredible marriage, and then as he was dying, she said she was experiencing his life review concurrently with him.
Wow. Wow.
And I've heard this a lot of times, but I always assumed that it had to be somebody that was intimate with the person, right? But
Yeah.
no. A few
Yeah.
years ago, Cheryl and I got a communication from a doctor who was called to the ER to resuscitate a patient he had never seen. And
Wow.
as the guy was dying, his life review appeared to the doctor.
Wow.
So, is something so weird is going on that the world has to brush by these things,
Yeah.
or else the whole structure would come,
Yeah. Right. Right. Well,
right? It's
what I think about with that sort of thing is it leads me to, and I contemplate this a lot, and I've never heard it put as you put it, the overstory. Like, hold on, why this person connected to this person and seeing their
yes,
life review, but they don't even know each other. And in some cases, obviously, it's more obvious they're very connected. But it's sort of like there's a bigger narrative here and connections that we don't necessarily, I mean, uh, my friend I just referenced who passed away in a freak car accident at the same time right around the same time he fell asleep at the wheel and hit a tree and passed, my car was getting stolen out of my driveway. It's like,
yeah.
hold on, what,
You
this
can see there is
weird
some
car
connection.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't figure it out.
Yeah.
And
Right.
listen, I was the first living person I heard this from, Brandon, was a guy named Dr. George Ritchie, who
Mm-hmm.
was a professor of psychiatry at UVA in 1965. I heard
Mm.
his story as an undergraduate philosophy
Mm.
student.
I'm from
And
Virginia.
so George was from Richmond, Virginia.
Okay.
And his
Yep.
experience took place at Camp Barkley, Texas in December 1943, where he was a recruit in the Army.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and my mother and father are from Porterdale, Georgia.
Mm.
Okay, now, after my book was published, okay, in 1975, I went up to Charlottesville again. I'd been medical school in Georgia, went back to Charlottesville to interview for my residency in psychiatry. That was the first time I'd seen George Ritchie in the 10 years. Okay. And so went back to Macon, Georgia the next day, and my parents had been keeping hold of my kids. And so by then, my dad had heard a tape of George Ritchie's experience. And to my utter astonishment, I still remember and I mentioned to Dad that the night before we'd been with this Dr. Ritchie, who had been the first living person I heard this from. And my dad said the following words: "Huh, that's really interesting. George Ritchie, Camp Barkley, Texas, December 1943. I was there, and
Wow.
so were you. My
Whoa.
mom and dad had moved to Camp Barkley in early September
Wow.
1943 so my dad could go to officers candidate school.
Wow.
I was conceived in late September at Camp
Wow.
Barkley.
Wow.
And George's experience was December 24th, as I remember. My mom and dad moved away as December 29th. I
Wow.
was there in utero when it happened.
Wow.
Then, flash forward about 30 years, I had always wanted to live in an old grist mill, but I'd given it up as unrealistic. In 1990 or 89, yeah, or 1990, I was just bumbled into one. I mean, it's just wasn't looking for an old mill then. I was just looking for a place to go. And this real estate guy said, "Let me take you by an old mill." And he said, "But it's trouble is it's not for sale." He said, "The reason I'm showing it to you is I go to the church with the children of the older couple who live in there, and they're afraid now. They've grown up and moved away. They're afraid of their parents living out in the middle of nowhere." So,
Mm.
he no cell phones at that time. Drove back to his office. "Ms. Dorr, can I bring this man out to see your house?" I heard, "You can, Kirk, but we're not going to sell this place." And I said, "We love this place." And took me, and anyway, I lived there for long enough to know people drop by all the time. "Please, can I see it?"
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's just back. So anyway, walked into the front door. "Hello, I'm Raymond Moody." "Raymond Moody, Raymond Moody, are you the man that wrote that book?" Took me to the bookshelf and got out George Ritchie's book, to which I had written the foreword.
Wow.
And it was inscribed to my dear friends, the Doors. And she said, "Well, Dr. George Ritchie is one of our dear, dear friends."
Wow.
She said, "This must be a sign." I mean,
Wow.
what is this?
Yeah. Right.
You got to take it seriously, but
It's
we don't have the mental equipment yet to
beyond
figure
our
it out.
comprehension. It's like we're only seeing pieces of the puzzle, and I think that overstory really is where it will all start to make even more sense personally. So,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
Well, guys, this has been incredible. What an honor to connect and hear your perspectives and stories, and to have, just such pioneers, here on the show has been wonderful. What is the best way for people to connect, and, obviously where to get the book and that sort of thing?
Well, in the book, which can be found, bookstores and Amazon, Barnes and Noble, etc., there's contact information. But they don't want to buy the book. They can contact Raymond at lifeafterlife.com or me at paulperryproductions.com.
Okay, great. Great. Well, I do have one final question for each of you. I'd love to hear my cliche closing question. And it
Okay.
is this, and you can both take a turn in 60 seconds or less. What is the meaning of life according to Paul Perry? What is the meaning of life according to Raymond Moody?
Oh my God. Did I eat up some seconds there? The meaning of life is to possibly not try to figure out what the meaning for life is.
Right.
It's rather to let life happen and let it guide you.
Mm,
Yeah.
I like
Well, to me, I think that the purpose of it is to progress in love and knowledge.
that. Yeah.
Hmm.
That's what I think.
Yeah. Love is the answer. Now, what was the question?
Right. Yeah.
And it's to have a good time.
And
Well, that's a
you have obviously done that. You are vibrant and full of fun. So yeah, thank you both for taking the time to do this today.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank all of you out there for tuning in your beautiful brainwaves and incredible hearts. Until next time, journey well.
Take care.
I love you so, 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 so